Hey guys, welcome back. So now getting back into our talks of Excalibur, which at this point still has the lingering issue of Apocalypse using this team for his own personal reasons. But as we go further along, I'm beginning to see like the justification within his actions. But even with that, it brings us across a lot of people and things which we haven't seen in a long time. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so jumping right back in, we see like what's the resolve for now with the situation with Brian Braddock, who was approached by Merlin and Roma not long after leaving Otherworld, to where he was tested again, but this time he chose the Sword of Might. But with him knowing that he made this different decision, choosing the sword over the amulet, he knew it was a product of him being different after being under the control of Morgan Le Fay, which is why he didn't want to wield the sword. So with doing so, he gave it to Betsy and told her to find a way to keep it away from him, because also if he had continued to wield it, it's likely that either Merlin or Roma would eventually have him go against his sister Betsy, either sooner or later, being that she's the acting Captain Britain, even though she wasn't chosen by them. So essentially with Richter's help, she puts the sword in the stone, which was one of those things that kind of had me like, okay, I see what you did there. But with doing this and also having Richter's help to cover it up, this was like your immediate solution to help Brian Braddock for the time being. But even after this, Betsy had some issues that she needed to sort out with Apocalypse, in addition to keeping an eye on her other brother Jamie, to whom being the king of Avalon is not a small thing, but to him he believes he's king of Otherworld altogether. But even with him being king of Avalon and Betsy being Captain Britain, they still communicate like brother and sister. So when she asks him like where's Apocalypse, he just opens up the ground and lets her fall through to where he's at. And he knows she'll be fine because she's Captain Britain, but even still with them taking shots at each other, it's very true to their relationship, which to be honest at this point in time is probably the best that I've seen it between the two of them. But when Betsy arrives here at the library to speak to Apocalypse, and Exodus is just chilling there like, what up? But really and truly it makes sense that Exodus is even here, because him and Apocalypse go way back, and not even like it's always been on the best of terms, with Apocalypse finding him and boosting his powers, but then later on locking him in the crypt and sealing it with a curse, so they've kind of had their back and forth. But in the grand scope of where everything is right now, it makes sense that Exodus would assist Apocalypse, or even Magneto for that matter, in current day Krakoan affairs. But as far as what we know right now, aside from Exodus being on the Quiet Council, and also in a separate group from Magneto and Apocalypse, that at this point in time he's also helping Apocalypse to some extent, but we probably won't see how that pans out till much later. But when Betsy arrives here and she expresses her concern to Apocalypse, and mainly for her suspicion of the obscure things that Apocalypse has been having Excalibur doing, he first reminds her that Krakoa is his home as well, and as a member of the Quiet Council, anything that he suggests or requests is for the betterment of that country. But in addition to this, to give her a bit more peace of mind, he shares with her pages of his grimoire so that she'll know more specifically what he's been up to and what he's been doing. But even with him doing this, I feel like this isn't even like the full script. Like, this is the version that Tom Holland gets before doing a press junket. Because I'm pretty sure when we get into the true reason of why Apocalypse is seeking the mastery of magic, or better yet the mastery of mutant magic, that some of his details may be on a need to know basis. Because if they weren't, then he'd be doing living autopsies in the front yard. Well, okay, maybe not in the front yard, but more people would know. But after sharing his grimoire with Betsy, this does give her a bit more of a peace of mind, but immediately after he gets into his next request. Because in the grand scope, time isn't necessarily a luxury that he has. But for his next request, he asks for the heads of 5 werewolves, which are needed for his next spell. Because right now with them opening their doors to Otherworld, they do still have the issue of anyone else being able to get through, which also presents the need for a tracking beacon between realms. And when Betsy's like, what does all this mean? He just tells her, read the grimoires, it's in there. And so at least that way she has a way to catch up on the rest of those details. But real quick, just to give you guys a bit of a better understanding on what werewolves are, where they came from, and what they're capable of doing, first I will say much of their origins and history is a mystery. And our first introduction to them was like in Excalibur issue 1 in the late 80s, where we later discovered that they were sent from the Mojoverse. But even then we were shown that these aren't kind creatures. They're part human and part lupine. They're literally skin crawlers. So when they attack, they dissolve your insides, then reshape themselves to fit inside your skin. But aside from even reshaping themselves to fit within someone's skin, they can also mimic their voice, their mannerisms, and much like we've seen with Rachel Summers, they can even block telepathy. But back at the time, not long after escaping the Mojoverse, when Excalibur had defeated the werewolves who had followed them back, they were later placed in the London Zoo, which is essentially where Betsy is heading at this time to retrieve what Apocalypse had asked for. But fast forward to now, when they get there, they're all gone. And the lady who worked there, like, she didn't really want to cooperate and tell them where they had went, but that really didn't matter because when Pete Wisdom was talking to her, Jubilee was hacking in their system and just downloading the information they needed anyway. And as it turns out, the werewolves were actually recently bought from the zoo to a private owner, to whom right after they immediately went to go see because Pete Wisdom's an agent and he admits that the government watches everything and he's using his perks to kind of help them out. And this is what leads them to tracking down Cullen Bloodstone, who's the son of the late Ulysses Bloodstone, but his family's pretty much famous for being like the world's best monster hunters. And I'd really say more so his father Ulysses and his sister Elsa, but the monster hunting thing, it really is legendary in their family because first, their father, with him discovering the blood gem, which not only helped him to combat monsters, but also gave him a number of abilities like enhanced speed and strength, allowed him to live for thousands of years, but we'll get back to more about him in a little bit. Because I don't think we've talked much about the Bloodstone family, and the only time I can remember us talking about the blood gem, it was like years ago when we were talking about Doc and Wolverine versus the Punisher. So we'll talk a bit more about the Bloodstone family in a little bit. But with them seeking out Cullen Bloodstone and asking him first of all, why would you buy a ton of werewolves? Like, what would you possibly want with those things in a domestic setting? Like, hey guys, it's my pet werewolf, but don't worry, he don't bite. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't trust that. But as we come to find out, he's very open about what he's doing with taking them to his family's summer lodge in order to destroy them, but to him doing this in the way of a sport. And with hearing this, Pete Wisdom's like, okay, cool, well if you want to kill him anyway, well let us just get the heads and we'll be on our way. But with Cullen being a purist in the sport of hunting, he lets them know that if they want the heads, then they would need to come to his summer lodge in England and hunt for the werewolves themselves. But also with doing this, we come to find out that he does also have like his set of rules when it comes to hunting and what he considers to be quote fair game. Because with him not liking mutants so much, he's prohibited Krakoan gates or any Krakoan flora for that matter from being on the premises of his lodge or involved with any of the hunting activities. But also when Cullen starts the hunt and everyone else from Excalibur makes their way out to the field, they start to have a bit of this conversation to where Gambit points out how it's kind of weird that the council has them doing this crazy hunt, and Richter's like, really it's not the council, it's just Apocalypse, which even pisses off Gambit even more because he already still feels some type of way about how Apocalypse had used Rogue and the potential danger or even suffering that Apocalypse's carelessness could have put on her. And for Gambit, knowing that little bit of information now, it just didn't help. But also while they're out here and they find a girl in the field who's just sitting there by herself, appearing to be either lost or stranded, but when Gambit goes to see if she needs help, it then turns out that she's a werewolf. And what's pretty crazy, like on top of this, like prior to this point, because there was a bit of this debate on whether they're actually sentient or more so if they had like the higher knowledge, which would lean more towards their human nature, and wondering with this if they had enough of a capacity to be reasoned with, like if they had the mental capacity, just to prove that they weren't complete animals. But after seeing this thing jump out this little girl's skin, it's like real quick that no longer becomes the conversation. But with them hunting the others and Rogue using her flight, Richter, he's filling out the terrain to track where they're hiding, and of course Gambit, who was first to bust some cards at the first one. Like, it caught him off guard, so that was a reflex. But with seeing this, Cullen quickly felt like they were using their advantages with their mutant powers, which caused them to be ahead of him within the hunt. And from his perspective, this wasn't fair, because though he didn't make it clear before, he did want everyone to engage in this hunt without using powers. And it's here where he goes semi-GLARTROX, which we'll go into much deeper in just a minute. But with doing this, it causes a scuffle because he grabs Jubilee, then he grabs Richter, but not long after they're able to restrain him because he didn't go full GLARTROX, and we'll get to that. But it's immediately after this where Cullen stops the hunt, they take it back to the manor, and they rediscuss everything after dinner, with the topic being Cullen doesn't want them to use their mutant powers during the hunt. But that conversation also goes sideways. But when he does this, he really talks himself into a corner because he wants everyone else here who actually is a mutant to hunt like a human. But here's the thing, because in the case of Cullen, who is a human, he was born human and he'd been human. But after his father had taken him on a trip to Clemor, the Black Realm, which for Cullen was like his father testing him on his birthday, and Cullen was supposed to prove himself while fighting off these creatures for a certain amount of time, but after his father had left him there, his father had actually died, so he was left there for like a little over 2 years before he was able to get out. And this is something you can imagine would take its toll on a kid that was only 10 years old when he went in, and he was a little over 12 when he got out, but also I imagine it explains a bit of why he is the way he is today. But also to clear up a bit of how his powers work, if you will. Like while he was in the Black Dimension, a parasite called the GLARTROX, it had bonded with his soul, and at the time he could only keep it at bay with the ring that held a piece of the blood gem. So whenever he took it off, he would go full GLARTROX, which was pretty terrifying because this thing was huge, strong, and fast. And it grows even bigger when it feeds off of negative emotions. But since then, which I'll roughly say is like 7 years ago, and I'm only saying that because Avengers Arena came out in 2013, which would make him about 19, but through the years he's also learned to use the GLARTROX very much like it's his own power. But with what I was saying about him talking himself into a corner, with him telling the members of Excalibur to move like humans and not mutants, Jubilee pretty much shuts this down with using her powers at the table and telling him like whether she uses her powers or not, she's still a mutant, which is something that Betsy then builds on top of by pretty much telling him that using this ring and having a parasite is a bit of a different situation, which you can tell is like that's not where Cullen wanted to go with the conversation. So he gets up like he's not even hungry anymore, he lost his appetite, and he just leaves. But much later on, once everybody's gone to sleep, Richter then goes for a walk because he's having trouble sleeping, and when he does, he overhears Cullen having a conversation with someone over the phone who Richter believes to be Coven Akaba. So of course he then tells Betsy, who of course does admit that it's a wild accusation, but it comes to the point where he suggests that they get what they need and get out of here, because either waiting to find out if that's true or hunting with Cullen the next day and not using their powers against werewolves, which are highly dangerous, is like a lose-lose situation. So now with them sneaking out and trying to snatch up these heads and get up out of there, at this point Rogue, who had absorbed some of the power from one of these werewolves and from there pretty much used his skin as a pelt, she then uses this method as an advantage to track more of them down, which does prove to be quite effective. But then when the ground starts shaking and there's like fireworks outside, Cullen pretty much puts 2 and 2 together and he's like, okay, these mutants out here in these streets and they using their powers, which of course he's not too keen of. But by the time he makes his way out there, they've already collected like 4 out of the 5 heads that they needed. And when Cullen gets out there, like they're only able to get away because Rogue, who was in disguise, she's able to catch him off guard and knock Cullen out just before they get ready to go. But at this point, with them already being like in Cullen's bad graces, they then just take the last skull that they need from Cullen, being that it was the one that he did collect while hunting without using the GLARTROX, which now total gives them the 5 skulls that they needed. But just before they go, here comes the other issue, and I really don't want to call it an issue, but when we find out that what they had found and taken home with them had actually been a baby werewolf, who of course they didn't want to kill. But even still, like everyone knew, like when Apocalypse had seen this thing, he was gonna be like, man, what y'all doing? And I'm not gonna front, like when I first read this, I thought it was gonna get dark. But instead, Apocalypse more or less just told Betsy that it's her choice to show mercy, but with doing so, it always comes at a cost. But after this, Betsy then ends up giving the baby werewolf over to Rachel Summers, which also makes sense because Rachel was there like when we talked about Excalibur issue number 1 from like 1987 or 88 when the werewolves had first came around and the team had been put together. And we'll probably see much more of this going into the new X Factor series, which I think was originally scheduled for April, but at this point it'll probably be out around like May or June. But so now real quick, I just want to give a shout out to all the Patreons. Thank you guys for all of your support, and for anyone who'd like to get more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below that'll take you to patreon.com/DopeSpill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Stay safe out there, keep distancing. It won't be like this forever, but stay encouraged, we'll get through this. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.